science enthusiasts. My name is Jason Zakowski. I'm a high school chemistry teacher and a science communicator, but I'm also the dog dad of Bunsen and Beaker, the science dogs on social media. If you love science and you love pets, you've come to the right place. Put on your lab coat, put on your safety glasses, and hold on to your tail. This is the Science Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Science Podcast. We hope you're happy and healthy out there. This is going to be a lightning round of the Science Podcast. A perfect storm has caught our family, with Chris being super busy at her job and parent-teacher interviews occurring for both of us. So we are a little swamped this week, and on top of that, a bunch of other projects with Bunsen and Beaker have been kind of taking up a bit of my time. So we're going to get right to the show. In science news, we're going to look at the Nobel Prize that was awarded for physiology or medicine. It's really cool. In pet science, now they're not really pets, but this article came up and we had somebody who was an expert in the fishing cat. So it's a type of cat that actually, it's a nocturnal cat that hunts for fish. And some scientists figured out why they were so good at hunting. So we're going to do a little bit of two sciencey articles this week. And in Ask an Expert, we have Dr. Wendy Bohan, who is a geologist. So we're going to talk all about rocks this week with our guest. So cool. Hey dogs, do you know why you should be patient with geologists? Well, they all have their faults. Okay, on with the show, because there's no time like science time. This week in science news, let's talk about one of the Nobel Prizes awarded. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to Svante Pääbo. Now, I'll be honest, I've never heard of the scientist before or what the scientist was working on. And the more I read about the research, the more fascinating it became. And the story with Dr. Pääbo starts with us, me and you, and all of the humans listening to this way back when we were early humans. Pääbo is a geneticist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and that's in Germany. And to make a long story short, and we'll get into the longer story of it, he found a way to extract DNA from bones, thus making a genetic imprint, thus making a genetic blueprint between humans, us, and our extinct relatives that are no longer around, like the Neanderthal. Now, if you're saying, wait, you can't get DNA from ancient bones, you wouldn't be the only one, because when Pääbo was talking about this to his colleagues, they thought he was bananas. They thought he was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, but Pääbo continued to work in the lab and over a long period of time stitched together teeny tiny fragments of Neanderthal DNA into sequences that could be read. Now, where did Pääbo get the DNA from? The mitochondria. That's the energy producing organelle of the cell, or the powerhouse of the cell, as I try and get my grade 10s not to say. And the mitochondria is interesting because it contains maternal DNA. And using the little tiny stitches of DNA, Pääbo completed an entire genome for the Neanderthal. If you want to know a little bit more about the DNA that Pääbo extracted, it was a 38,000-year-old fossil discovered in Croatia. Like, it's just bananas. It was absolutely bananas. How did they get the DNA from the bone? Well, taking tiny fragments of DNA from this bone that they were able to find that wasn't corrupted, they put it into a bacteria, and the bacteria then augmented it to a size that they could study. One of the interesting things that Pääbo's genetic sequencing has found is that our ancient human ancestors and the Neanderthals had children together. There was interbreeding between these two species of, subhumans. Another thing that Pääbo's study of the DNA within a bone determined, there was another extinct human relative called the Denisovans. This is fascinating because I have never heard of the Denisovans before, and the Denisovans interbred with humans as well. And what Pawdcast found was DNA that came from the Denisovans, from these extinct human-like creatures, influences us today. Genetic information from the Denisovans helped us adapt to higher altitudes. But also some of the genes from the Neanderthals make us more susceptible to some viruses, including COVID-19. The ability to take the genetic information from bones, mitochondria, and trace our origins back to find our DNA has been mixed with ancient human species that no longer exist. I was fascinated by this. Now, another interesting fact about Pawdcast is his father won a Nobel Prize too in medicine in 1982. That's science news for this week. This week in pet science, well, we should probably be clear. These aren't pets. They are fishing cats, and fishing cats are these larger than house cat, but way smaller than you'd think of a wild cat like a jaguar or a lynx or even like a tiger. Obviously, they're little cats. They are urban cats. They live close to people and they hunt for fish in lagoons. So this article came up on my feed and I was like, hey, we actually talked to a fishing cat expert a couple years ago, Anya. Anya's actually from Sri Lanka. Now, this study is looking at the fishing cats and how they hunt and how they catch fish. It came up on my feed and I was like, oh, that's adorable. We have to do a recap about the fishing cats because I'm sure there's some folks who have been listening to us for a couple years. So this comes from the culmination of the Fishing Cat Project. Now, I know Anya mentioned it. I don't think she was involved with it, but it was, they had some money to put up some camera traps. From 2016 to 2018, they were strategically placed around where the fishing cats would go, and they got a whole bunch of videos. One of the things that Anya mentioned is that these cats are nocturnal, and they're notoriously shy. So you could live in an area and know that they're around, but maybe only see them a couple times in your life. And that's what Anya talked about. It was quite frustrating. She works with the fishing cat conservation, but she rarely, if ever, gets to see them. So what did they find about how these elusive, adorable cats hunt for fish? So one of the things the cats do is they wade into the water, in deep water, until most of their body is submerged. Yes, so they go in the water and they have their little cat head basically just sticking out of the water so they can breathe. And they wait there patiently, so immobile, and then strike and they get their fish. When they analyze the videos, they only caught the fish about 4% of the time. The other way the fishing cats hunt is they patrol the shallow areas and they wait and they bide their time and they patrol and they quietly move around until they see a fish and they paw it out of the water. And you might ask yourself, how are fishing cats different than normal cats? Well, they do have a double layered coat, which lets them stay dry. And they do have retractable claws, which allows them to hook and hold onto fish. As Anya said, this cat is like wickedly understudied. I believe there is no known count of how many there are in the world because nobody has bothered to try and count them. So they do live in Sri Lanka. That's where Anya was talking about it, but they're notoriously hard to find. It's adorable that they got videos of these cats, and I would love to see a fishing cat just sitting there in the water, because like cats don't really like the water, and just sitting there waiting with its little head out of the water just patiently, and then wham, gets fish. Anyways, that's pet science. Remember, with a caveat, these aren't pets, for this week. Hey everybody, before we get to the interview section, I thought I'd let you know how you could help out the Science Podcast. The Science Podcast will always be free to download. You'll never have to worry about paying for it. But here are some ways that you can help us out. Number 1, check out the merch store, www.bunsenburnerbmd.com. The merch store has adorable gear, the Beaker stuffy, and now text from Bunsen. Number 2, think about joining the Pawpack community. It's going to be replacing Patreon, so thank you Patreon supporters. But if you aren't part of the Pawpack, we'd love for you to join. Our new community will take what we do on Patreon and supercharge it. There's going to be so many cool perks to joining the Pawpack community. Look for it in the next couple weeks. Third, think about reviewing the Science Podcast on a podcast player and giving us a great score. It really helps. Back to the interview. It's time for Ask an Expert on the Science Podcast, and I have Dr. Wendy Bohan, geologist. How are you doing today, Wendy?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yay. We were talking right before I started recording that we're going to be talking earthquakes, and I don't believe we've ever had a guest that specializes in earthquakes. So I'm super excited. Do you get excited talking about earthquakes too?
I do.
I love it. I love it.
Here's a weird story. I mean, I get so excited about earthquakes that I felt my first earthquake and I completely changed careers because I thought the earthquake was so interesting. Yeah.
Whoa. Okay. That's ground shaking. But one of the things we ask our guests right off the top is like, where are you in the world? Where are you calling into the podcast from? You don't have to give me like your exact address, just like geology.
I feel like as a geoscientist, I should give you my exact GPS coordinates, but I won't. I am in Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay. Right. So you're a couple hours ahead of us. You're on the East Coast then. Well, yes. East-ish coast.
I'm as far east as you can get, just about.
There we go. Okay. And I introduced you as a geologist, and you have a doctorate. Is your PhD in geology, or is it a whole bunch of stuff?
It's primarily in geology. So I actually started off as a theater major. And
really?
I had a theater scholarship and the whole thing. And I took a geology class while I was in undergrad and loved it. So I ended up getting a double major in theater and geology. And then a bunch of things happened. Eventually, I went back to school and got a master's degree and a PhD in earthquake geology. But for my PhD, I also studied geoscience, communication, and education. So a little of everything.
Now, this is going to throw a bit of a monkey wrench into the follow-up question I always ask guests is, what got you into science? Because usually it's from a younger age, but you were on track for something completely different. Was it that course that you took that made you take a right-hand turn, or was it the feeling of the earthquake?
It was a lot of things through time. I always liked science. My dad was a naturalist, so I spent a lot of time outside. But I always identified as an artist. You know, I did painting and I did a lot of pottery stuff and acting, obviously. And, you know, I moved out to LA to be a professional actress and did that for several years. And then the earthquake happened. And once the earthquake happened, I mean, I'd never experienced anything like that. I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to get involved. And I went and volunteered at the USGS Earthquake Hazards Program. And eventually they hired me. They were like, you're actually really good at this. And you're really good at talking to people, right? So the theater came in and was actually really helpful in my career and continues to be helpful. But that was really what started it, was the earthquake, the Hector Mine earthquake. Yep.
Wow. Well, that makes sense because like on my day job, I'm a teacher, so I talk for a living. So being a podcaster is just more talking, I guess.
Yes,
less classroom management, though, I'll have to say. And so from your master's and then your PhD, you now know all about earthquakes from when you were experiencing it. You've answered some of those questions. So that's the first big arcing question I have for you is what causes earthquakes? What is an earthquake?
Oh, see, that's the fundamental question.
Yeah.
What is an earthquake? Most people think of an earthquake as shaking, right? Because that's how we experience an earthquake. But an earthquake is actually the release of stress and strain that's built up inside the earth as a result of the motion of the tectonic plates. And so eventually, the stress and strain are just too big and it causes the rocks to break. That sends energy out in all directions, and we feel that energy is shaking. So that's what the earthquake is. And there's the thing about science that's fun and also challenging is that for every question you get answered, 3 more pop up. So I've answered a lot of the questions that I originally had, but now they're like triples, right? I have so many more questions.
I think I posted something similar to that today on Twitter, that science is, you just don't know what you're doing at the end of the day. You started knowing something at the end of the day. You're like, I actually know less than when I started.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's where the imposter syndrome comes in, right? You know
Mm,
something very deeply, but the more you know about it, the more you know that you don't know.
this is true. What is that called? Where I had it on the tip of my tongue. It was you inflate the sense of what you know, but you actually know less than what you know.
Oh, Dunning-Kruger? The
Dunning-Kruger,
Dunning-Kruger?
yes, yeah. Scientists are not within Dunning-Kruger,
Yeah,
but
most
the late whereas sometimes the layperson would be. They're trying to explain earthquake science to somebody like yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing though. That's one of the things I like about geoscience just in general is that everybody has experience with it. Everybody walks on the ground.
Mm.
Everybody interacts with dirt. Everybody mostly has seen mountains or different kinds of landforms. So everybody has some knowledge and experience about it and some curiosity, hopefully, about it.
I have never felt an earthquake, even though we had a couple near where we live in Alberta, Canada. We're not near any tectonic plate that we know about, but there was a weird one, they think, caused by some kind of oil activity. That was enough. Yeah, like some kind of frack quake, it was called.
Yeah, so we can, as human beings, create earthquakes. Usually, they're the result of wastewater injection, sort of a part of the fracking process. So, in order to get hydrocarbons out of the subsurface and different kinds of rocks, you inject water in a slurry down there to break the rocks up, which helps to suck the stuff you want out. But when it all comes out, all the things you put down plus the things you're looking for, it's dirty. And so you take that wastewater, not me or you, but the energy companies, and they inject that back into the ground because the bedrock can act like a big sieve and clean things out. The problem is if there are faults that are down there that are oriented in the right way, the water can almost act like a lubricant and can create earthquakes at rates that we wouldn't see naturally. So would those earthquakes have occurred? Sure, but they might have occurred, 500,000 years from now.
A different kind of time scale.
Right.
Gotcha. Oh, that's cool. I did not know that. I'm glad I brought that up. There was jokes and there was memes. Like I took a picture of my classroom and I tipped over a chair and I was like, the great earthquake of Alberta, like that was all over social media in our neck of the woods because the people that felt it was just like, and then it was over. So,
Yeah.
not like the destructive earthquakes in other places in the world, for sure.
Sometimes the stories about earthquakes last longer than the earthquakes themselves.
I like that. I might steal it. So with earthquakes, here's a question that maybe I would like help answering. There's a lot of misinformation about predicting earthquakes and then using those predictions to warn people. People might read online that animals can predict earthquakes, or technology can predict earthquakes, or your great uncle Edward's knee starts to hurt, so he's predicting the earthquake. Where are we with that, Doc?
So there is no way to predict earthquakes, and anybody who tells you differently is selling something. We can forecast earthquakes very much like a meteorologist can't really predict the weather. They can give you a good idea of what's going to happen, and they can give you a time frame and say, there's a 70% chance of rain on Wednesday. But you would think they were nuts if they said, there's a 100% chance of rain in a week at 1:15 p.m. You'd be like, maybe not. And yet people expect earthquakes to work that way. It's not how it works. We can say something, now we're working on geologic time, something like there is and I'm just pulling these numbers out of the air, an 87% chance of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area in the next 30 years. So we predict them on a longer time scale, but we want to give people a sense of what to expect and then also give them a way to prepare. Because if you think about it, our buildings are already there, our communities are there, our schools, our businesses. We can't just move away from active plate boundaries. We have to learn how to live with earthquakes, regardless of when they happen. And so we need to have better building codes. We need to have people that know what to do when they feel earthquake shaking. We have to be ready for them when they come,
Now, is that something that I'm a little off topic from the questions I sent you, but I'm just curious. growing up in a place in the world and living in a place in the world that has zero earthquakes. Is that something that is predicted for that whole western part of the United States, like the San Andreas Fault with the rock? Is that whole area due to have some kind of massive earthquake in the future? Like, of course, like we're dealing with big timescales here.
Right. So California has thousands and thousands of active faults. The San Andreas gets talked about a lot because it's the largest fault, the longest, and so it can produce the largest magnitude earthquakes. But in fact, many of those faults can produce earthquakes, which can cause a significant amount of damage. And they can happen at any time. We know that the stress and strain is building up in the crust. We can measure that using GPS instruments. We can dig down. These are some of the things I study. We can dig down inside of the faults and
Really?
see evidence for how the fault moved the ground in the past. And then we can date those different layers to figure out when those earthquakes happened. We can do that in different places to figure out the magnitude. So we can get a snapshot through recent time, 10,000 years maybe, of when earthquakes happened on this fault to get a rough idea of how often those earthquakes happen. We take all of these things along with soil conditions and other things and say, this is the amount of shaking that we expect over this time frame. We know this much stress and strain has built up. We know this area has earthquakes about this often. This is what we think we can expect.
And can I ask, do you know one off the top of your head? Is there a bad earthquake being predicted in the next 10,000 years?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So, for instance, everybody talks about the San Andreas Fault, but its sister fault, the San Jacinto Fault, is actually the most active fault in Southern California. And it's had 11 magnitude 6+ earthquakes in the last 120 years.
Oh.
So the San Andreas in that southern section hasn't had an earthquake in 300 years. That's about the recurrence interval, give or take a couple hundred years. So we're getting close to a southern San Andreas event. There's also the Cascadia megathrust off the coast of British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. And we know the recurrence interval of large earthquakes on that fault. The last one was in January of 1700. And there's earthquakes on that fault every, 300 to 500 years. And it's been, it's been a while. So we know
that makes sense because we take groups of kids out to Vancouver Island and they have to be warned about tsunamis from earthquakes.
Right.
There's pictures of people like, I don't know, like the emergency exit signs in buildings when there's a fire, somebody running down the stairs from the fire. There's like a little picture of a stick person running away from a giant death wave. And the students are like, is that real? And the guides are like, well, yes, but there'll be sirens and stuff. So, okay.
Yes. Important note about tsunamis. If you are near the water and you feel prolonged shaking from an earthquake, that is your natural tsunami warning. So after you've finished dropping, covering, and holding on to make sure nothing falls on you, you want to leave the area near the coast as soon as possible and evacuate following the evacuation routes that you have just outlined. There's signs, there's often sirens that'll go off, but you can do it vertically, like going inland and uphill, or you can do it horizontally, so going up to the top of a tall building if there's no, close by hills nearby. So
right. Okay. I have so many questions about earthquakes. Could I ask one more before we go to the rest of like what I was scheduled to ask you?
I talk about earthquakes I do talk about earthquakes all day. What about
It's just so fascinating. It's so alien to me because we just don't experience them. Our entire middle part of Canada is like tectonically nothing.
How I got stuck in this? I'm from Virginia. We didn't have very many earthquakes. So I felt one and I was like, hold the phone. I've got some questions.
Okay. So so when I actually teach kids a little bit about earthquakes in school and there's these different waves. Do you feel those waves in a real earthquake? Like there's like the thud, which is the P wave. And then there's like the S wave.
Right.
If the earthquake is strong enough, do you actually feel that? Or is it just the surface waves that come later?
It depends on where you are.
Okay.
So if you're close to where the earthquake is happening, you won't be able necessarily to differentiate between the waves because they're all kind of coming at you at once.
Hmm.
The farther away you are, the more spread out the waves are going to be. So you would perhaps feel the P wave as a jolt, and then you would feel the S waves. That's where the kind of the rolling shaking would start, and then you get the surface waves later.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're really far away, this is where people will say, oh, it was a jolting earthquake or a rolling earthquake. So if you're close by, you get all of the different wave frequencies. But if you're far away, those high frequency waves attenuate or die out. And so you're left with the surface waves, which are like the long period rolling waves, right?
Hmm.
And we have analogs to this in our life. So, imagine you're sitting in your house and a car goes by and it's like really bumping the bass. You only hear the bass. That's the low frequency sound. The high frequency sound of the singer or the guitar, you don't hear that unless you're really close to the speaker. So you can think of earthquakes kind of like that.
That is a great analogy.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on to my next question because I'll derail our whole interview here. With your research, you've studied a whole bunch of like different types of time and scale and how mountains form from earthquakes. Could you explain a little bit about that? Like geochronology. Hopefully I said that right.
Basically, I date rocks. That's part of what I do. So geochronology and thermochronology are dating rocks on different timescales using different techniques. But let's start at the top. So I think first about how earthquakes change the surface of the earth. That's called the geomorphology, or the shape of the earth. And by looking at the way the land is shaped, you can actually learn a lot about the underlying structures. And so I like to look at landscapes and use those hints to figure out where the faults are. Once you know where the faults are, using the hints in the landscape, we dig down inside of the faults. That's called paleoseismology. And I talked about that before, where you can date the layers. And
Mm-hmm.
this is like a technique a lot of people have heard of. Carbon-14 dating, for instance, is a technique that we use. We also use something called optically stimulated luminescence. And these are just different ways of dating the layers to figure out when the earthquakes happened. Now, eventually, if you have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 earthquakes in a trench over a few thousand years, well, now imagine it's a scale of millions of years. So now you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of earthquakes that have occurred that have lifted up these mountains. And so we can take rocks that have moved from inside the crust up to the surface and date minerals inside of those to figure out how fast that mountain has come up while all those earthquakes were happening. And so I kind of work on all these different scales to understand how earthquakes change the landscape through time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes, well, I'm dumbfounded. Like, it makes sense to somebody like, I guess, me, that is kind of a dunce to begin with, because, but anyways, are all mountains made that way? Like, are there some mountain ranges that are more made from earthquakes than others? I'm just curious, like, because the Rocky Mountains are an hour's drive from us, right, where we live.
Right. So there's different ways of making mountains. If you think about the Western US, that's actually places where the crust is getting stretched apart. And so in this case, instead of the earthquakes lifting up the mountains, they're actually dropping down the valleys. And so you get mountains that are higher just by default, right? As opposed to, say, the Himalayas, where you have 2 continents that are colliding with each other and raising up these mountains through time through the result of repeated earthquakes. But it's always earthquakes. And so the Rocky Mountains are a remnant of past collisions and past tectonic activity. I have 2 7-year-olds, and I talk to them sometimes. We watch a lot of Godzilla movies and, kind of like fights between these huge beasts. And I explain when I talk to them and when I talk to elementary kids, I'm like, basically the earth has these 2 giant forces that are fighting against each other. Tectonics, which is lifting the ground up, and erosion, which is tearing the ground down. And depending on where you are, depends on who's winning. So that's my big analogy to Godzilla and earthquakes.
There you go. It's like Godzilla versus Mothra or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
Or Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla. Or Godzilla versus some other third creature.
In this case, there's no good and evil with Mothra and Godzilla either. It's just processes and how they're operating in different places and on different scales.
Oh. So more erosion would be like the Grand Canyon in the States? I don't know.
Yes, the Grand
Okay.
Canyon is a great example of erosion. And,
Hmm.
if we think about how long it takes, you can build up mountain ranges like the Himalayas. It takes about 250 million years for those to erode back down to a flat plain. So the Appalachian Mountains in the US are getting close to that. They've been
Right.
around.
Those are your mountains on the east side, correct? That
Yes,
are
yes,
quote
those.
unquote mountains. But if you know the Rockies like I do, and you go there, you're like, these are hills, guys.
Well, they used to be as big as the Himalayas.
Right.
But all these millions of years of erosion have worn them down. So we're looking at the bones of the Appalachian Mountains.
That's so
The
cool.
interesting thing is that all of that sediment has spread out on both sides. So it formed, the east coast of the US, a lot of that is mantled or covered up by the sediment from the Appalachians, and the same thing in parts of the Midwest. And that changes how earthquake waves travel in these different locations. So on the west coast of the US, where we have the active plate boundary, which is where most of the earthquakes happen, that crust is all broken up. It's hot. The waves don't travel through it well. They get stuck in all these faults. On the east coast, the crust is cold and old and dense, and it has this huge mantle of sediment. And wow, earthquake waves love to travel through those. So earthquakes on the east coast are actually felt over far greater distances than earthquakes of a similar size on the west coast.
Wow. That's amazing. And then just because Alberta has both a mix of mountain ranges and prairies, does all of that, like the weathering of those giant mountains back to plains, does that explain the fertile ground in that area for farming?
I'd have to look, but
Okay.
maybe.
Maybe. I
don't know so much about farming. I know that volcanic flow is good for farming, but I'm going to stay in my lane here and say maybe.
Perfect. Yeah, volcano stuff's hecka good for farming. We're fresh out of that in Alberta as well. So
Yeah, not a lot in Virginia either. We do have one volcano called Mole Hill, but it's like old and dead. So.
Oh, okay. Fascinating. I'm so glad I asked you that question, because as I was saying, I was creeping on your website and there was all these terms. I had no idea what the heck. So I was going to ask them all in a row, but they're all just tied to geological timescale, earthquakes, and mountain formation. Very cool.
It's sort of different techniques. I have things I'm interested in, questions I'm interested in asking, and I need as many tools in my tool belt as I possibly can so that I can attack those questions from different angles. And so those are just different tools that I have that I've learned through my studies.
Okay, before I have my page is full of follow-up questions. This is terrible. Before we get on with our standard questions of the podcast, I have one that I love asking scientists who study a field that is in movies. Is there a particular movie that does earthquake stuff bad, like really bad, that comes to mind, that you watch it and you're like, come on?
There are so many. I'm having a hard time picking one.
Is it that bad? I was wondering if it was just so bad everything's awful.
10.5 was really bad.
Okay.
San Andreas, I love The Rock, hey Rock, call me. But that movie is a mess. I mean, it's just a mess. None of that, you guys. None of that's real. That's all cinema. No.
Do you watch those, and are you okay saying, oh, it's Hollywood, I'm going to watch it for enjoyment? Because some scientists, when I've asked that to, they're okay with that, but there's some scientists, the back of their brain is just like, nope.
I can't.
You can't?
I spend my life trying to dispel misconceptions. And I spend a lot of my free time talking to people on the internet that have a lot of fear and anxiety about earthquakes. And so it's hard for me to enjoy it when I feel like it's like plotting against my life work, right?
Gotcha.
To make people
I hear you.
Just please, no. I see why they're interesting, but I struggle to watch them.
I definitely hear you. The same thing goes with the astrophysicists I've talked to, right? Some space movies like Star Wars is complete nonsense. And there's no sound in outer space.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Are you okay with me moving on to the next couple of questions? The more standard ones. Okay. This is absolutely fascinating. By the way, I'm so glad I'm talking to you. We have a couple standard questions on the podcast. One is the pet story. So we'll take a little bit of a right turn from earthquakes to animals. We ask our guests to share a pet story from their life. Could you do that with us?
Yes, I love my pets. They're part of my family. So the first dog I ever had, and this was not very long ago, her name was Dakota, and I had twins when she was alive. And the boys were, I don't know, they were infants, and they were colicky, and we hadn't slept. And the nursery was upstairs in our house. And my husband had been doing something, and he ended up leaving a towel on a hot burner. Okay. And I had no idea because I was upstairs with the kids, and he left.
Oh,
And
okay.
the towel catches on fire, or it's smoking, about to catch on fire. And this dog, at the time, she was a German Shepherd mix. She was like 12. So she was crickety. She was partially deaf. She was partially blind. And she would not leave me alone. You know, she was nosing at me. She was scratching at me. She was whining, completely out of character. And she finally got me to get up from where I was tandem nursing babies, and follow her downstairs. And she's the reason that the house didn't catch on fire.
Wow.
Yeah. So thank you, Coda.
Oh,
She was the best of girls.
that is a great story.
Yes. I said I'd never get another dog, but here we are.
What's your current dog's name?
Brody.
Brody? Aw.
He's a good boy.
And what kind of dog is Brody?
Oh, he's a mutt. He came from rescue, and we did have his genetics done.
Yeah.
He is a strongly English Shepherd with some bulldog and some pit bull and who knows what. But he is 100% very good boy.
Gotcha. Yeah. I don't think the average dog owner needs to take a DNA test to find that out. But it is curious what their ancestry is, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. I hear you though. Our first family dog was a golden retriever, and when we lost her, I was like, oh my God, I don't think I can go through this again. But the house is awful empty, and once you're over the grieving process, inviting another dog into your family is sometimes helps. And that's where Bunsen came from. And yeah, that's where Bunsen came from. So
I feel like there was a dog that was sent to me. We were driving home for Christmas, and there was a dog on the side of the road. And of course I pull over because it's a freeway and you can't leave a dog on the side of the road. And I get her into the car, and I called the number on her collar, and they didn't pick up. And so I had kind of just said, well, I guess we have this dog now, because I'm not going to take her to a shelter, and there's no address. There's just this phone number. And, after 20 or 30 minutes, the person got back to me. But at that point, I had firmly committed to, this is our dog now. And that night I started looking for another dog. So.
Aw.
Yeah.
That is a wholesome story.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing your pet story with us, Doc.
Sure.
Yeah, that's great. The other question we ask our guests on the Science Podcast is to share a super fact with us. It's something that when you tell people, it kind of blows their mind or shakes their world, pun intended. Do you have a super fact you could share with us?
I actually asked Twitter this question today because I was like, there's so many. What do you think, Twitter? So I was like, what is an earthquake fact that blows your mind? And I got so many great...
I saw that tweet.
Yeah. So go and find my Twitter if you're interested, because there's so many great responses. One of the ones that I think is the most compelling and the most just mind-blowing is that an earthquake from really far away can actually cause pools and other parts of the country to move. It's called seiche, when it moves back and forth. And so you can have an earthquake thousands of miles away that cause seiche in a pool, super far away.
Like sloshing? The water just goes skloosh, skloosh? Oh, really?
Yeah. So if you're somewhere and you see water sloshing, it's possible that there was an earthquake really far away that you can't feel, but the water is responding to it.
Oh, my goodness.
Also, the length of time that earthquake shaking can last is really, really mind-blowing. So the Tohoku Oki earthquake in Japan in 2011, the shaking lasted for 6 minutes. I don't know if you've ever sat somewhere and been terrified for 6 minutes.
Oh my goodness.
A really, really long time. Most earthquakes only last a few seconds. So, the idea that this significant level of shaking can last for that long is scary.
Did people just acclimate to it and they're like, well, this is us now, time to go for coffee? Like what?
Oh, no,
That's
no,
so,
no.
how bad was the earthquake? Like enough it would knock you off your feet if you
Oh,
tried to
yeah,
walk
it was
around?
a magnitude
Oh
9.
my,
That
what?
was the Fukushima disaster that caused the massive tsunami. So there's actually video if you go to YouTube,
What?
Japan earthquake airport or something, where you can see the level of shaking that the people at the airport were experiencing. And I get choked up because there's this woman who is, I'm going to get choked up. She's shielding this small child with her body, and the tiles are falling around them, and people are sheltering in place. It's really the interesting thing about Japan is they have more earthquakes than basically anywhere else on Earth. They have 100,000 earthquakes every year. Lots of those are felt, and they are so good at building for earthquakes. Their population knows what to do. Japanese cities often sway but rarely topple. So seeing people that knew how to act in the earthquake, people weren't panicking. Nobody was running and screaming. Everybody was doing things to keep themselves safe. So it's terrifying to watch, but it's a really good lesson in how appropriate earthquake engineering and an educated population about a hazard can actually change the outcome in significant ways. There is no natural disaster. What we have are natural hazards that overlap with vulnerable systems. And Japan has really made itself not as vulnerable to earthquakes because people know what to do and they build to withstand.
That is amazing. I've seen the buildings sway it's just incredible. It's probably because they've been attacked by Godzilla so many times too, right? Like they're just prepared for this level of nonsense the average place isn't.
I am telling you, Japan is the place to feel an earthquake.
Okay, I didn't mean to make light of going for coffee. I feel kind of terrible about that joke. No. I apologize to the listeners. I did not mean to. I did not know it was that serious.
Well, humor has actually been shown to be a really good way to talk about hazard and disaster. So there's a new paper out by Sarah McBride from the USGS talking about using humor to communicate about disasters. So you did just fine.
I tell you, if the ground was shaking that bad in Alberta, Canada for 6 minutes, people would be like, what's going on, eh? Like they'd just be like, it would be crazy. It would be, people would lose their minds. Yeah, I guess the same thing happens if it like snows in Texas. People are like, what is this? It's too cold. They just don't, their structures, they're not built for it. So,
yep. See, that's the thing that it's all about the vulnerable system. If we're not prepared for a particular hazard, then we're much more at risk from that hazard. It's like earthquakes on the East Coast. There was a really huge earthquake in South Carolina in 1886, and large parts of the city were destroyed because South Carolina is not built to withstand earthquakes. It's built to withstand hurricanes and floods, right? So we build for the hazard that we have to deal with most often. But in truth, everywhere is earthquake country. Just about anywhere can experience an earthquake or shaking from an earthquake. So it's just good to know basically what to do. You don't need to be scared. Just be prepared.
There's a recent, like, you're probably following the earthquake in Afghanistan. And that their infrastructure is so destroyed. That's why the devastation was so bad. It's like whatever buildings the people were in just came right down on top of them. So
certain structures, earthquakes move the ground in lots of different ways. You get an upwards push, a sideways thrust, a downward drop, a sideways push in the other direction. And so the structures that fare the best are ones that are able to flex and bend. So wood frame structures like single family homes, those tend to do really well. But if you have really rigid material like stone or concrete, that's not going to fare as well because it's going to break and collapse. And so that's what we saw, unfortunately, in Afghanistan.
Yeah, tragic. But it's good we're talking about this. Be prepared. Doc, I have one more question before we move on. Are there places in the world that if there was a giant earthquake right now, that would be the end of the city? Like the city would just be, that would be the it of it. Like, cause there's pipes underground, right? That's the thing that I'm trying to get to a question here. Like underground, there's all of this infrastructure for water and sewer and electricity, correct? Is that something that cities have to plan for when there's an earthquake?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so let's take, for instance, the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco.
Yeah.
there are reports that the fire actually did more damage than the earthquake. And so if you think about what that means, say, for Los Angeles right now, let's say there's an earthquake and the Santa Ana winds are blowing. So there's high winds. You're going to break a lot of the gas mains. You're also going to break a lot of the water mains. So people may have fires starting and then not be able to put them out. Now, if you add high winds into that, the fire spreads quickly. So you have what's called a cascading disaster. You have the earthquake and the effects of the earthquake, which could be buildings collapsing. It could be landslides, liquefaction. And then on top of that, you have this weakened infrastructure that's no longer able to function as it should. And so you're not able to deal with things the way that you would on a normal day in a normal situation. So there's a lot of initiatives right now where state, local, federal governments and communities are coming together to do these earthquake scenarios. There was one in Southern California called Shakeout. There's another one in the Pacific Northwest called Cascadia Rising, where they have the scientists go in, they look at the infrastructure, they figure out what buildings are weak, they figure out what bridges are most likely to fail, and then they work with all of the emergency responders and the people who are going to be involved in the earthquake response to figure out where the holes are, where we can strengthen our response, what things need to be fixed now so it doesn't become a disaster later. So first you have to identify what those things are, and then you have to work towards fixing it. Part of that is, just getting the monetary buy-in. If we spend $1 now, that'll save us $1,000 later. But, the reality is there's a lot of things that are important. There's a lot of things that we could put money into. So it's trying to figure out how to best spend our dollars. And of course, I think that it's really important to prepare for earthquakes and infrastructure because those are the things that keep me up at night. But, there's a lot of planning that goes into it.
Yeah. Oh, it's just like everything. There's only so many dollars. And if a geologist is like, well, the earthquake's going to happen in the next 10,000 years, the politicians are like, I'm pretty sure I'll be out of office by that point. So they're going to focus on something else.
Yeah. So part of it is people understand why it's important to do it now.
Yes.
What actually are the numbers if we don't do anything? What does this look like for my town if we don't retrofit, if we keep these buildings, unreinforced masonry buildings or soft first stories, things that are known to collapse during earthquakes? What does that mean? How many people are going to die?
It would be horrific, wouldn't it? When just whole cities grind to us, like they'd be done. They would be over.
Yeah, I think that, people can always rebuild, and it's much better to fix things now before you have to rebuild.
Yes, that is a good message.
What is it? The ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or something like that.
That's right. Well, as we say in education, for every dollar invested, you get 2 to 20 out.
Yes.
Okay, I derailed this again. I'm just going off my list of that was supposed to be a super fact, and it became a super long discussion. Thank you for humoring me, Doc. The last section of the podcast, we get to know a little bit more about our guests outside of what they study. Folks talk about causes or hobbies, and you wanted to talk a little bit about inclusion in science. You have an organization that you are part of. Would you like to chat about that?
Yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity. So it's called 500 Women Scientists. There's far more than 500 of us. There are chapters, we call them pods, all over the world. There's more than 20,000 members. And our mission is to make science safer and more inclusive for people that are minoritized in the scientific establishment. And, we do a lot of things. We do a lot of writing. We do a lot of activism. And one thing I really wanted to mention was that we have set up this new it's a website called Gauge. And the idea is that we want to get more women's voices into the public sphere. We want more women who are experts in things to be seen as experts and to have that expertise channeled into things. And so if people are looking for an expert to come into their classroom or to give a talk or to be on a TV show or whatever, you can go on and search by field of expertise, location. We have women from all over the world. And so it's a great opportunity to have people actually use the knowledge and expertise that women scientists bring to the table. We want to get to a point where we don't have to say women scientists. We can just say scientists. because it shouldn't matter if you're a man or a woman in the scientific establishment, but it still does. I'm in a very male-dominated field, and we're working to change that. We want to make sure that the culture that we bring people into is safe, that people can do field work and feel safe, that, all of the different, we can bring all the different parts of ourselves to our job. Because as scientists, who we are impacts the science that we do, right? Our experiences help to form the questions that we ask and the things we're interested in. And so it's important that we are able to bring our whole selves into our work, because we dedicate our lives and our careers to this. So
Mm-hmm.
we want people to feel safe and supported while they're doing work that really can help to change the world and make the world better.
Absolutely. I've said this before, is like, for the longest time, science was male dominated, still is in some areas. And like, effectively cutting out half of the population of the earth to ask questions and do research and solve problems is not the greatest way to go forward as a society.
That's right.
Could you send me a link, and can we put that organization into our show notes?
Absolutely. 500womenscientists.org, but I will definitely send you a link.
Okay, perfect. So as we always do, folks, if you're listening, the link will be in the show notes. Make sure you're not driving. So you click on that thing if you're commuting via bus or something, or if you're listening at home or mowing the lawn or taking your dogs for the walk. Geology, you said is there's more men than women. Do you see that changing in the next few years, or is this something that as a group science will have to work at?
Well, there in geoscience, there has not been any progress on minority scientists in the last 40 years. I'm not counting women in that demographic.
Okay.
But racial and ethnic minorities, no progress in 40 years, which is discouraging. And I think part of that speaks to the culture of geoscience, which was very much beer drinking, flannel wearing, field going. And it's not that anymore. There are elements of that. Like, I do a lot of field work, but that's not required anymore. There's a lot of computer modeling, there's lab work, there's all kinds of different ways that you can contribute to science. And so I'm hoping that by having things like social media, by having things like this podcast, we can really start to show the next generation of people that geoscience is something that they can be a part of. You don't have to love camping and drinking beer to be a geologist, right? Like, that's a stereotype, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so we're seeing more women come into the field, and we're hoping that we can get other different kinds of people that have different intersectional identities also into geosciences, because it's really important that we get everyone's voices contributing to the scientific endeavors. And we're missing out on some of the key critical observations and questions if we don't have all kinds of different people in our field. So I'm hopeful, but we haven't really seen it yet. And we've got to do a lot of cultural change, and we're trying hard to do that work.
Change only occurs if we talk about it, and people do something. So at least on our podcast, we're talking about it, and people can click and maybe help do something about it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it. And I think we all need to push where we have power. Sometimes things can feel so overwhelming. There's so many things that should be changed or that could be improved. And so we don't do anything. So I think if we can all find the space where we have a little bit of power and just push there, raise awareness, make somebody feel welcome in that space. Whatever you can do, find it and then do it. Because it's all those little things that build up through time.
It's funny. I didn't know that was a stereotype of geology, but I'm a chemist. And anytime I mention that I have a degree in chemistry, they think I'm like Walter White from Breaking Bad or something like that. So there's always those stereotypes out there.
But you do a lot more than just stand around in a lab coat mixing up potions, right?
Well, that is the exciting part of teaching it to kids is the mixing of exploding potions, like Severus Snape or something like that. I'm not as mean. Okay, well, I'm glad we had this conversation, and again, there'll be links in our show notes. All right, we're at the end of the chat. Again, I have 500,000 more questions. This is such a fascinating discussion. Thank you for giving up your time from your busy life to chat with us on the Science Podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being able to talk to you and to talk about the things that I love. So thanks.
Yay. Take care of yourself, and we wish you nothing but the best in the future. Tag us if you need any promotion for any of the stuff that you do. Just tag the Bunsen and Beaker account.
Hey, same to you. And follow me on all social media at Dr.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry, Doc. Let me ask that question. Before we close, can people follow you on social media?
Yes, I am everywhere. I'm Dr. Wendy Rocks, except on TikTok, I'm Dr. Wendy Rocks It.
Okay. Did somebody steal your handle? What's going on?
I guess. I don't know. It wasn't available. But I am too old for TikTok officially, but I'm there anyway, being the wise elder or something.
We wish you nothing but the best in the future with all that you do.
Thank you so much. Everybody take good care.
Okay, it is time for story time with me, Adam. If you don't know what story time is, Beaker is...
Shenanigans.
Beaker dropped her stick and got excited. If you don't know what story time is when we talk about stories that have happened within the past 1 or 2 weeks. Dad, do you have a story?
I think my story is just about the joy that Bunsen and Beaker bring us. Chris and I have had a really busy 2 weeks. In fact, the podcast didn't go out last week because we just all ran out of time. Like, there was only so much time in the day, and it was gone. And I was like, you know what? There's no point pushing the podcast out if it's going to be, subpar or damaging our mental health. So one of the things that we never ever shortcut is time with the dogs, and especially walks and through our fields and the forests that we have behind the farm. And even though Bunsen may have rolled in something really stinky, it's a highlight of my day to take them out through the forest, through the fields, watch them romp, take some fun video of them, take some fun pictures of them. You just see the joy on their faces. They're so happy to go and frolic about. And it doesn't matter. Like, my days aren't a bad day at my day job. They're not bad. Like, they're just busy, but it definitely rejuvenates you seeing them frolic about and have so much fun. So that's one thing that we don't cut out. We might cut out the podcast, which happened last week. But we make time for the dogs, and it's worth it. So That's my story in a general sense.
In a general sense, yeah. But keeping in mind, too, last week there were parent-teacher interviews for you twice a week and Royals for me. Yeah. It was just a lot of after-school things that we had to do. And I took the dogs for a walk, but it's not the same. It's not the same when it's dark out and we can't go into the creek area because critters are around.
Well, at night, and it's uneven ground. You don't want to be walking down through the creek. It's kind of treacherous in places and pitch black.
Okay, so I have a story. I have updates on the farm animals. I have an update on the little chick, whose name I think we announced on the podcast being Matzi or Matza, because it looks like cheese. It's bigger now. It's about half the size of the other chickens, but it still has that nice yellow color to it. So it's still a really cute little chick. And then Mouse, the farm cat, still just as much a menace to society. He is a funny cat. He plays with stuff around the house and makes so much noise. And then when you're walking around, he'll run up behind you and then start biting your feet. Or if you're laying, or if you're like sitting down on the couch, he'll like run up underneath you and then start biting your feet. And if you're like under a blanket, he'll burrow into the blanket and like get into like a dark spot. And it's really funny and really cute. So the farm animals are doing great. The chick and Mouse are still super cute. So yeah, that's my story. Mom, do you have?
I sure do. Today, actually, I went downstairs and it was super funny because we had a laundry basket on the stairs. And so Bunsen came down and then saw the carpet and he was like, woohoo! And Beaker came down and then it was carpet fight because they have traction. But first of all, they had to check to see if Adam was in his room, and he was not. And then they always kind of want to go into the laundry room because that's where Ginger's cat box is. But I said, nope. And Bunsen's like, okay. And then it was carpet fight. That's right, Bunsen. And he's done his chew. So now I get toddler time Bunsen here. So awesome. Anyway, so now I'm like, no, we're going to go up the stairs. And then there's this laundry basket that's kind of blocking the landing. And Bunsen's like, oh no, I want to stay downstairs, but I also want to come upstairs. And then he turned himself around. And I said, uh-oh, because now we're almost near the laundry basket, almost near the less space that's there. And he had to do a quick turn on the stairs, and he did it. So I think the maze events are making him a little bit more agile.
Oh, that's funny.
Well, I don't know.
He's learning about his body space because of the silly maze games.
Yeah, but you should have seen the look on his face when he was downstairs and he realized he had purchase. Because that actually happened this week too. When they went outside, they were like, woohoo! Oh, and yesterday we were going for our walk and Beaker went around the corner and I heard a sound.
Oh, no.
And I was like, that was weird. And then Beaker came running around the corner and I had Bunsen and Jason was kind of ahead. And I said, she's got into a porcupine. She's got into a porcupine. There's quills out of her mouth. Jason, no. What were they?
They were feathers.
Yeah.
So she said hello to one of the chickens for like about 5 seconds. A nice hello. A dog, Beaker hello.
A Beaker hello was the chicken that I heard. But I didn't.
It got away. It was not hurt. I couldn't even find feathers where the chicken would have been.
But are you
good.
saying no chickens were harmed in this experiment?
Well, I'd say a chicken was frightened by Beaker's hello.
Yeah. But we were proud of her that we didn't come back to like a dead chicken on the ground because that would have been traumatizing.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, I told a lot of stories this week. It's been eventful time here with our dogs and Ginger.
All right. So that's it for story time. Thank you so much for listening to my section of the podcast, and I can't wait to see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Well, that's the end of this week's show. Thanks for coming back every week to listen to the Science Podcast. We took a week off last week, you might have noticed. Things just got too busy, and we literally ran out of time to work on the podcast. So we're really happy it's back. We'd like to thank Dr. Wendy Bohan, who talked to us about geology, earthquakes, and how the Rocky Mountains were made. It was a great discussion. We are in the midst of converting all of the patrons to the Pawpack Plus. So this week we don't have a list of folks to read off, but I just want to give a shout out to the adult and the teen level of the Pawpack Plus. Thank you so much for joining up, and it's going to be released to the wide world next week. So you'll hear about it on the podcast next week. That's a wrap, everybody, for science, empathy, and cuteness.